Well, good afternoon. So good to see all of you here today. I'm Lynn Stallings. I'm one of the co-directors of the Civil Rights to Civic Virtue Project. It is my privilege to welcome you to today's lunch, organized by AUM Civil Rights and Civic Virtue Society, and funded by a generous grant of the John Templeton Foundation. The mission of the Civil Rights and Civic Virtue Society is to foster civic identity, commitment, and civic mindedness through community-engaged learning opportunities. Towards that end, the speaker series provides us a forum to host individuals who have distinguished themselves through their service within the community and through their ability to advance our understanding of the civil rights movement or the development of civic virtues. Today's our CV Speaker Series event is the third of the semester, the sixth of this year. And sadly, it's the final one of the grant, but it's going to be a special one today. Although the grant funding period ends this summer, keep in mind we have two special events left. May 14th and 15th, the Out of the Box workshop that you're all welcome to come to. We'll have special speakers as well as AUM faculty and staff speakers, who they're special too. And then June 23rd through 27th, we'll have our summer seminar speakers. So watch for more information about those events. So I have asked AUM student Joshua Stout to introduce today's speaker. Joshua is a sophomore English major. He is from Montgomery. He's last year's most outstanding freshman for the Department of English and Philosophy. He is the president of the Creative Writing Club. He's a member of the University Honors Program and the English Honors Society. Thank you so much, Joshua.
Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure that I introduce Mrs. Lila Weaver today. She's the writer, illustrator, and co-translator of the Spanish edition of this book, Darkroom, a Memoir in Black and White. She's also published My Year in the Middle in 2018. As a graphic novelist and documentarian of the immigrant experience in the American South, she has a lot of experience visiting other colleges, other campuses, and classrooms, and delivering the same experience. So I ask that you all receive her today.
Thank you so much, Joshua. And I want to, first of all, thank Dr. Stallings and Dr. Duncan Payton for inviting me to be here with you today. I love that this many people would gather to hear something on the topic of civil rights, something that's very near and dear to my heart. So, writing my book, Memoir in Black and White, gave me the unique opportunity to explore some of two major factors that influenced my life, and that is my experience as an immigrant. I came to this country as a 5-year-old. My family immigrated from Argentina. And then secondly, how the timing of our arrival in this country put us in close proximity to some of the most consequential battles of the civil rights movement. So that's what we're going to get into today a little bit. And I want to add that I never thought I had a story to tell. My life felt pretty ordinary. And most of the events that I describe in my book regarding the civil rights movement felt far removed. They felt like settled history. And I really didn't stop to examine or question too much about them until about 20 years ago. And this is why. The book that you're looking at right here in this slide is what served as my wake-up call. Have you ever had something like that? A book to just spur your curiosity, spur your drive to know more. And that's what this novel Birmingham by Anthony Grooms did for me. It is a work of fiction, and the main character is a young boy in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. That's when most of the story takes place. Now, 1963 was a year of terror in Birmingham, in the city's black community. And they gave it the nickname Bombingham because this was a time when there was a retaliation against the black community for the economic boycotts and sit-ins and other forms of protests, mostly by the Ku Klux Klan setting bombs in the homes of the leaders of the movement of that city. And that includes Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. Have any of you heard of him? The airport in Birmingham, Alabama is named for him. So, just to detail a little bit about what was going on in 1963 in Birmingham. In May of that year, there was a Young People's March. Those images from that march are famous because that's when the police commissioner of that city, nicknamed Bull Connor, was out there with his force, with police dogs and fire hoses attacking the young people that took part in that demonstration. And you've probably seen photos of that. It was a terrible moment. But then it got even worse. In September of that year, members of the Klan set off a bomb in a church, 16th Street Baptist Church, that you may have heard of. And in that bombing, 4 young girls, innocent girls, were killed. So the author of this book takes historical realities and weaves them into the life of his fictional characters. So just as with any good book, I was hooked by the story alone. But it did something else for me besides being a good read. The history behind the plot came alive for me and stirred all sorts of questions. And I realized that up to then, the things that had happened in Birmingham had been little more than headlines to me, that I had not stopped to question that much about what really happened there. Because I was a child, was a very young child when these things were happening, and so of course I wasn't keeping up at that time. So this curiosity and this hunger to learn more, not only about Birmingham, but also about other events of the 1960s that took place in Alabama, is what drove me to write my story. First, a little personal background. So as I said, my family immigrated to the United States in 1961 and from Argentina. I was 5 years old at the time, and I spoke not one word of English. So how we ended up in a tiny town in the middle of Alabama is a question I get a lot if I don't address that right away. It's a complicated story, but I'll give you the simplified version, and that is that in his teenage years, my father, who lived in a city close to the Andes Mountains, he was an orphan, he came into contact with American missionaries. That connection is what eventually led him to go to the U.S. He went to seminary in New Orleans, went back to Argentina, and then and years later, decades later, all of us came to the U.S. and because of his contact with Baptist Church, ended up teaching at Judson College. So Judson College is a 4-year school, was a 4-year school, it recently closed, that was started by the Baptists. So that's the background, and that's why we ended up in this small town named Marion. Anybody ever heard of Marion, Alabama? Okay, see some heads nodding. So it's these slides, these images that you see in this slide are just actual scenes, actual buildings from Marion at that time when we first moved there. just to give you the sense that it's just like any other small town in this part of the state. Some of the familiar features, if you have any familiarity with small towns in this area. Okay, now where is Marion, and why does it matter to my story, and why, and more importantly, does it matter to the civil rights movement? So I'm going to actually read from this page. It sits on the northern edge of the Black Belt region, named for its fertile dark clay soil, where once upon a time cotton reigned as king, and slave-holding plantations composed the state's economic core. So Perry County, where Marion is, and Marion is the seat of that county, in the 1960 census was 65.8% African American, 34.2% white. Until we arrived. And we, as Latinos, introduced a sliver of gray into that demographic pie. So this is critical to understand. I'm telling you about it. You may have already long known this, but I didn't get why so many of the most impactful events in the civil rights movement in the state of Alabama happened in the Black Belt region. Can you think about why? How does it relate to this diagram? How does it relate to that demographic pie I have there? Yes?
Because it was predominantly black.
Yes. Yes. So that meant two things. That meant that the organizers of the voter rights campaign knew that they had more voters, a potential of more voters. On the opposite side of the ledger, the white establishment in that area knew that they had a lot to lose if the black citizens in this area, which were majority, but did not have the vote until the campaign to push to get the people registered to vote took place. So once I understood that, everything kind of fell into place. I thought, okay, so that's why these things happen in the Black Belt region. Okay, when we arrived, the civil rights movement was picking up steam around that time. It was the year of 1961 was the year of the Freedom Riders. Have you heard of that? Okay, this was a regional campaign to basically to test the right of any citizen to ride public accommodations, public transportation. It's a lot more to it than that. But anyway, it's infamous in its own way because when that bus reached Anniston, Alabama, it was set fire. And when that bus reached Birmingham, Alabama, a mob was waiting there at that station and actually got on the bus and beat people up. And there are photos to show in the station that appeared in newspapers across the country, the violence that broke out that day. Well, I was a little kid, I didn't know anything about that, but that's just part of the dark history that was going on at the time when we arrived in the U.S. But what I do remember, I was not too young to notice, to fail to notice the whites only signs. Those were still up. And I remember walking down the streets of the little downtown in Marion, Alabama, and seeing those. And shortly thereafter, in 1964, when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, and those signs started coming down. And at the same time, guess what happened? In the drugstore that I have pictured here in one of my drawings, there used to be what they called a soda counter with, you could get like ice cream sundaes and malts and things like that. You see that in movies, I'm sure. Well, they closed down that counter. Why? Because the law then became that they could not refuse any customer. They had to serve any customer that came in, and they didn't want to. So they just preferred to just shut it down. So I remember having seen that counter and sort of like, oh, ice cream, I want to go back and get some. And then before I knew it, it had vanished. So this is part of our important history in our state that we all need to be aware of. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to read just a little bit from the next section that I picked out, which is also about what we call, you've heard the term Jim Crow, and this is sort of the nickname for that. At that time, legal segregation in the South of public places, the legal segregation. So this is what I saw, that black patients had to use the health clinic's alley entrance. They could not go through the main entrance. And inside a separate waiting room. I saw this with my own eyes. I saw that black maids were supposed to sit in the back seat of their employers' cars. I saw that black people were supposed to go around to the back door of white people's houses. So as I reflected on that, as I began writing the book, I realized that it still came to me as a shock that I had seen those things. And you'll note that some of those things had to do with the Jim Crow laws. Other things just had to do with social customs that were very rigid and in place to divide society, to make sure that white people stayed dominant and that black people stayed in their place. Yeah, just make sure you understand air quotes around that. Okay, so a few, I think I might have skipped a slide. There we go. Yeah, pardon me. So another milestone after the dismantling of Jim Crow that I just explained to you was the desegregation of public schools. And this happened in 2 phases. So this is something that I discovered as I began researching, and I'm trying to remember why was it that when I was in the 4th grade, one African American girl was in my class, just one. And then 4 years later, when I was in the 8th grade, all of a sudden we were 100% desegregated. It was white kids and black kids going to school together. And as I looked into it, I realized that that first phase called freedom of choice was kind of like, you can send your children to white schools if you want to, it's up to you, that sort of thing. And so a few families did, and one of those families was the parents of that young girl that was in my class. So by the time I got into the 8th grade, then federal courts had said, no, it's time. Full desegregation, stop playing around. So that's why I, in my 8th grade year, for the first time experienced sitting in the classroom with black classmates. Okay, all right, so after the dismantling of Jim Crow, and in between that and the desegregation of public schools comes the era of the civil rights movement that I wanted to focus on the most, and that is the push for voting rights. So this started off in the first months of 1965 that I remember marches taking place in my hometown of Marion. So I was in 3rd grade, and just as you might expect, a 3rd grader doesn't really know what's going on. I just knew that black people were marching around the courthouse square, didn't really know why they were marching. And of course I did understand that there was heavy discrimination against African Americans, but I did not know that when they tried to go register to vote, that they were being systematically turned away. And there were all kinds of tricks. I don't know the precise tricks that went on at Perry County Courthouse where I lived, but across the South, things like this would happen. You have to take a literacy test, all right? And the test would be something impossible for the most literate person in the world to pass. It had every sort of confusing and impossible task, like recite the entire Constitution, or just something on that order. There were also things that were way simpler, like we're closed for lunch. Oh, and by the way, lunch lasts all afternoon. Too bad you didn't get here at 10 a.m. Well, if they'd gotten there at 10 a.m., there would have been some other excuse. It went on and on like that. So for that reason, people were protesting, and they were marching. They were organizing and pushing and trying to get the federal government to intervene and show how the law was being broken all across the South, especially in these regions like the Black Belt and in neighboring states, where Black citizens were not being allowed the vote, which is the right of every citizen. So during this period, in January and February of that year, and these marches were going on, my dad, who was kind of part-time photographer, got very interested in what was happening. So he took his movie camera, it was just a simple home movie camera, and he walked down to the intersection, which was very close to our house, where these things were going on, and he took home movies of people gathering in front of the church that is directly across the street from the courthouse. So here you see one of the drawings that I did, which is based on some of the footage from those movies that my dad took. And also the marches around the courthouse. And this, again, I took from those home movies, these images. So, like I said, the marches had been going on during the daytime, pardon me, in January and February. Then, on February the 18th, 1965, they decided to do a nighttime march. And this was because one of the participants in the movement was in jail, and they wanted to walk down to the jail and kind of serenade him by candlelight under the window of his jail cell. But it was a big problem. Nighttime marches were notorious for outbreaks of violence, so this was a really big risk that they were taking, and I assumed that they knew it. It drew, because of the potential for violence, because of just being such a powder keg at that time, it drew the attention of national news outlets. So at a street corner right there across from the courthouse, where the nighttime march was supposed to take place, were a group of reporters and national journalists, and there were even some from the New York Times, from NBC, ABC, and so on, that were there. And my dad, who I previously mentioned was a photographer, sort of as a side job that he did, he decided he could maybe get some historical photos. I'm sure he did not realize how dangerous it was. He went down there and he stood among those journalists and reporters and TV crews. Well, in addition to the marchers and the journalists, there was also a large mob of mostly white men that had gathered. And they rushed at the reporters and smash their cameras or spray their lenses with black spray and ended up beating some, including one who was a household name at the time. Richard Valeriani was a reporter that you saw on TV, on NBC News almost every night. He ended up going to the hospital with a skull fracture because somebody cracked him on the head with a club. And of course, they also attacked the protesters themselves. They used clubs, they used chains and axe handles, and they did this in full view of law enforcement, who did nothing to stop it. And if you read the literature on this, it wasn't just Marion City Police and Perry County Sheriff. There were also state troopers there, and there were also law enforcement officials from neighboring counties that just came over just because something big is going to happen and we want to be a part of it. Okay, so I've told you about some of the things that happened, and I want to give you an orientation as to where the locations were. So what you see on the left is the drawing that is in my book that I made, sort of a bird's eye view. And then the photos that correspond, the current day photos. I took these photos, well, let's see, probably in like 2008, when I was working on the book and doing all the drawings. So at the very top, the building that you see is the county jail, and that's where the man that they were going to serenade in that nighttime march, that's where he was. And then next you see the courthouse. And then the church, which was, because of its location, it was ideal for organizing the march where people would gather, and this is where a lot of that action took place. And then at the bottom, you see my family home. And so we lived 1 block from where all this action took place. Behind the church was a little place called Max Cafe. It no longer exists. But Max Cafe is where this young man, Jimmy Lee Jackson, 26 years old at the time and one of the participants in the march, with his mother and his grandfather, was running down the street in the dark, trying to get away from the mob. And so he decided, let's duck into Max Cafe. A state trooper followed them in there and shot Jimmy Lee Jackson in the stomach. 8 days later, he died in a hospital in Selma, Alabama. So this went off like a thunderclap in the black community. And it got even worse when, not long afterward, although Mr. Jackson was unarmed, the state of Alabama officially exonerated that state trooper. So it was that day's equivalent to the George Floyd incident that we had a few years ago. How did they react? How did the organizers of the voter rights campaign react? They said, we've got to do something bigger. We've got to do something that creates visibility that cannot be denied. And that's when plans were formed for the march from Selma to Montgomery that I know all of you have heard about. And I know that all of you have seen images of it. And it blew my mind when I realized that the death of this young man who had, I'm going to go back because I accidentally went forward. The death of this young man who had been shot 1 block from my back door is what kicked off this huge, globally known event that eventually made the difference and brought about the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that changed so many things, that brought down these practices of turning registrants away, that made life so difficult for black citizens in the South. So, let's see, I've already jumped ahead accidentally. I'll show you the next image is, just to give you a sense of what those film reels that my dad took in 1965, they were mixed in with home movies from childhood, Christmas mornings, kids playing in the yard, all those sorts of things are kind of mixed in together. So I sent those off to be digitized, and that's how I was able to freeze frame and use actual, stills from those movies to create some of the art for the book. So I was tremendously ignorant about what had happened in my hometown, in practically my backyard. So to write Darkroom, I just plunged into research. I began to read many books, these are just a few of them, and watched documentaries and interviews and just dug into it, and it really became a passion for me. I learned so much. I'm afraid a lot of it's rusty now, but it was very vital and stirring to me to finally be able to connect the dots between those things that I vaguely remembered and to understand finally how they all fit together. So one of the aspects of the book that I decided I wanted to cover was the type of textbook that we had as elementary school kids to teach us Alabama history. This book was published in 1957, and so I would have been in 4th grade, like around 1966. And the author of the book was a professor. I think he was the head of the Department of History at the University of Alabama in the 1950s. One day, way before I even thought about writing a book, and I was in the public library in Tuscaloosa where I live with my kids, and I saw that in the children's area, in the reference section, I spotted that book. I said, oh, that was my textbook that I haven't seen in eons. And I flipped through it, and I got kind of excited at the same time that I was also newly shocked by the contents of it. So that was probably sometime in the, 1990 or something like that. So when I started my project to write this book, I said, oh, please still be there. Please be there. And so I went back to the public library, and sure enough, the book was still there. So I was able to make photocopies because I wanted to share with my readers how we were being educated as elementary school kids in the 1960s, what we were being taught about important history. So of course the book contains a lot of things. It contains, about the space race and about how Huntsville became, key to that, and about many things about governors and so on. Well, there are 2 chapters that I decided to represent in Darkroom. And one is a chapter on plantation life, and the other was about the Reconstruction era after the Civil Rights, after the Civil War. So here you see an actual page from the book that I photocopied, and what I did in my book was to take words from the book, straight from the book, and replicate them, and then accompany them with my own drawing. So I want to make sure that you understand these are not my words. I'm not doing a good job with it. Okay? I don't know what happened.
The left button should go. The left button should go back.
Okay, that's what I'm pressing. It says end of slideshow, so I guess I inadvertently took it all the way to the end. Okay. All right, pardon my flow here. here we go, at last. Okay, so I took words from the book, from that old textbook, and it's telling a story about a little boy and a little girl who are growing up in a plantation. So they are from the privileged family. Their father is the master of the plantation. And first thing they do is run, in the morning, they run downstairs, and it says, the Negro cook, who you call Mammy. Basically, she brings these children their breakfast, and it is really astonishing how this is represented. It says, you have known her for all your life and love her very much. And she, greets the children, Miss Mary and Mr. John is what she calls them, and then they call her Mammy. Then, after breakfast, the father invites the son to go ride in the fields, so the boy, this would be Mr. John, gets on a horse with his dad, and they go off to the cotton fields. It says you can see Negroes working in the white cotton. In these days of slavery, the plantation owners had many slaves. Most of them were treated kindly. There were a few masters who did not treat their slaves kindly. As you ride up beside the Negroes in the field, they stop working long enough to look up, tip their hats, and say, "Good morning, Master John." You like the friendly way they speak and smile. They show bright rows of white teeth. "How's it coming, Sam?" your father asked one of the old Negroes. "Fine, Marse Tom, just fine. We got more cotton than we can pick." Then Sam chuckles to himself and goes back to picking as fast as he can. I don't know how many things you can see wrong with that, but just about every word, there's something highly disturbing about the way that this is represented. And I had more reaction to this and the corresponding pages from the Reconstruction era chapter than just about anything in my book. Places that I've gone to speak, and people have said, that blew my mind. I could not believe that this was in a textbook. So I just wanted people to understand how I was taught and how people from my generation were taught during those years. Well, Darkroom didn't cover everything that happened in the 1960s and early 70s, and later I wrote a children's book. It's fiction. I made up a character. There's all sorts of things in the story that have nothing specifically to do with history, the history of that era. But I wanted to include something about another very impactful episode of that era, and that is the governor's race in 1970. So you all remember George Wallace. You've heard his name, I'm sure. Well, George Wallace was not governor at that time. It was his lieutenant governor who became governor. His name was Albert Brewer. Now, Albert Brewer was a moderate, and he was considered someone who wanted to usher Alabama into the era of the New South, like to leave all of that old, ugly stuff, all of the racist period behind. He wanted to clean up Alabama. But George Wallace had his eye on the White House, and so he decided that being governor again might sort of give him a leg up. So he decided to run against Brewer in the primary. I was in the 8th grade when this happened. And my brother-in-law worked for Governor Brewer. So we heard all kinds of things, the ugly things that the Wallace campaign did to the Brewers, the most horrendous, hideous rumors, and many of it just deeply, disgustingly racist. In fact, when I was researching my children's book, I came across a book called Mudslingers, the 25 dirtiest political campaigns of all time. It's written by a man named Kerwin Swint, a historical scholar. This was published in 2008. And guess which campaign came in as #1 in his list of the dirtiest in U.S. history? It was this very one, George Wallace against Brewer. I have one more slide. This is a scene from the Jonathan Daniels Pilgrimage, which takes place every year in August in Hayneville, Alabama. So that's Lowndes County, so that's not far away from here at all. The reason they hold this every year is to commemorate the assassination of a young Episcopalian seminarian who was, in 1965, there in Lowndes County helping to register voters. This was a big thing that it drew people from other states to come and try to make an impact, try to change the world in their own way. Well, he, along with others, was in a county jail. They were arrested for trumped up reasons. And then when they came out and they went to a little country store just like steps from the county jail, they were gunned down, or he was gunned down there. The others were not killed. So Jonathan Daniels is honored every year in this pilgrimage, along with the other martyrs of the civil rights of the state of Alabama. So I've been twice to the pilgrimage, and it really touched me to see this poster of Jimmy Lee Jackson and to know that someone that I only vaguely remember, oh, someone was shot and then someone died, and it was just all disappeared in the fog of time for me, that eventually I came to know who he was, what he represented, how he formed a part of a community, of an army of citizens who were fighting for the right to vote, and that he ended up at age 26 becoming a martyr for this cause. So I just wanted to share these things with you so that you would get a sense about what I, as an immigrant kid, saw, things that I witnessed, things that I lived through, things that I came eventually to wonder what was it all about, and how I've researched and put this story together to create my book. And I want to thank you so much for listening, and I want to give you opportunity to ask questions or make comments, and that's what we'll slide right into that now. So. So does anyone have a question?
Hi, my name is Karan. Thank you for speaking to us today. So you drew all of the pictures in the book? That is so amazing. You are so talented.
Thank you.
Do you ever like advocate or march with any of the current marches or protests?
The most recent opportunity that I had, I passed by, but I have in recent years. I would love to go to Selma for one of their yearly marches at some point, but I have not had an opportunity to do that.
Hi, my name is Isaiah Dodge. I'd like to ask, what's your biggest motivation as a writer?
I think that if writing is in you, like if it has touched you, if you have felt that impulse to want to write, that it's very hard to keep it down. And I began to write in the 1990s, just journaling, just as part of processing what I was feeling about things. In fact, I was seeing a therapist at the time, and that therapist actually recommended to me, why don't you write things down? There is a quote that I don't know who to attribute it to that said, I write to know what I'm thinking. And you know, our thoughts are just a tangle in our heads, and a lot of times we just can't sort them out. But writing, and after a while, things become clearer. So that would be, I guess you would say, informal writing, but informal writing has to come before formal writing. You really can't expect or dream of, becoming a published writer without having started wherever you are. It's just started from point number one. So, thank you, great question.
Thank you. And also another comment, I love the art style in your book, especially the way you drew the lighting. It reminded me of like the old timey art styles. I can't put my finger on it exactly, but it reminded me of that.
Well, thank you so much. So I am very different from most graphic novelists. If you look at graphic novels, most of them are done in more of a comic book style. But I was never a cartoonist or comic books creator, so I had to do what I know how to do. And also, it relates back to the fact, I didn't say anything about this, but the reason the book is called Darkroom is multiple reasons, but the main one being that my dad, as I said, did photography, and that I was so fascinated by the process in the darkroom of how you take, film and develop it, and then how you use the film to cast an image onto this paper, move it along down the line of these vats of chemicals. So I decided to create this book. It's a long story, but I decided to create it almost in the form of a photo album or a scrapbook. So for the most part, the drawings I wanted them to look like photos. So that's part of the reason, a big part of the reason for the style. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to thank you so much, and I'm about your age, and I have always wondered what I was taught about Alabama history, so I'm going to have to find a copy of No Alabama. I have two questions. The first, I'd love for you to say more to our group about the fact that the seed of this book started in a college class. I think they'd be curious about that. And the other, I don't remember knowing many people from other countries in the late 60s, early 70s. I was curious if your family experienced prejudice.
So you have to understand that the way that I measured prejudice was by comparing the truly overt racial prejudice that I saw in front of my eyes every day targeted at Black people. So in my mind, we did not receive that. That is not to say that there wasn't a milder and subtler and less, it was hard to pinpoint, So I had the sense that we were not quite first-class citizens, not quite welcome into society with the same enthusiasm, but you couldn't really say, yeah, that happened. It was kind of, you had to read between the lines. Oh, yes, okay, forgot. So I was enrolled in a program at the University of Alabama that is created to help adults who want to finish their college degree, and in my case I had gone 3 years, and then I want to go back and finish it, but life is full. You're either working or have a family or both, and there's not much time to go, especially to attend in-person classes on campus. So I was in that situation, so I enrolled in this program. It was under New College, so it's kind of an interdisciplinary institution. I don't really know if this is true across the board in all programs similar to this, but they gave you the possibility of of being able to go to school, do like digital distance learning and all that sort of thing, and that's mostly what I did. There's a senior project that is mandatory for graduating under this program. And for my senior project, I decided to do an illustrated, very small version of what you see here. You know, that I had absolutely no thought in my head that it would be published. So I bought a photo album, the kind that, you know, you can put photos in with those little corner mounts. Bought one of those and then made my drawings and wrote my captions and used the entire book, 40 pages of it, to tell a very streamlined version of this story. So that was my senior project, and I got a lot of acclaim, you know, just a lot of approbation for it, and that's what led to eventually getting a book contract to expand it into a full-length book. So, okay.
Hi, my name is Harrison. So you had mentioned your family was from Argentina. Did you ever decide to go back to your place of origin and compare? Because I'm also Hispanic myself. I think you and I both are kind of aware that the things that were happening here wasn't just here.
Yes.
It was south of the border. And I personally would argue that it was just as bad, if not worse, in the sense of Latin America, whereas, because in most societies they had the concept of blanqueamiento, which was the whitening of one's skin. The mentality of the darker your skin is, the harder your life is. So did you ever go back to Latin America and learn about it as well?
So my first trip back to Argentina was 44 years after I left as a child. And by that time, my father had passed away. My mother really had only a couple of years left. I went back and I loved it, but I did see exactly what you're talking about. Specifically, what I saw was that at that time there were a lot of newish immigrants in Buenos Aires is primarily where the city, the main city in Argentina. And that's where I spent most of my time. That immigrants from Paraguay and Bolivia and Peru that were there because there were job opportunities there at the time, people with darker skin. And oh boy, it was so clear to me that racism was heavy duty on the part of a lot of people. And it really saddened me so much because my parents did not raise me to accept that. And I had this delusion, I'll call it, that Argentina was different. Well, when I looked into the history of Argentina, it turned out that at one time, they also had African slaves. What did? They eradicated them all. So they're growing up, I always heard, there are no black people in Argentina. Well, there was a reason for that. It's because they killed them all or removed them all or whatever. So it's a very shocking and distressing history that is replicated in different forms all through the Latin American, the South American and the Central American regions, and there are versions of it in each part. So you're absolutely right that it exists there. So was there a second part to your question? I can't remember.
You actually went back there to see it as well. Compare and try to see that.
Yeah.
It really isn't that different. It's not here.
Right.
The entire Western Hemisphere. I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah, it's like the entire Western Hemisphere, going back to the colonial times.
So I think what I have observed, I don't have a dissertation written on this or anything, but I have observed just going through life, is that when the population of some outside group is very small, people don't really care that much. But when that population starts growing, then people begin to bristle and start having problems. And I saw that in Alabama, that when we were coming up, we barely even knew any other Hispanics. There were a few Cuban families and so on. But as more and more Central Americans and Mexicans starting arriving in Alabama, and I'm gonna say like around the 1980s, when I just started seeing that there were more and more. And then that anti-immigrant, anti-brown skin, and so on, just started fomenting. I saw that. I saw that happening, and I can only say that I don't know if we've even reached the peak yet. It's terrible.
Are there any other questions? Well, again, we would like to thank Mrs. Lila Quintero Weaver for speaking with us today and sharing your story about growing up in Selma, Alabama. Marion, Alabama. Yes, ma'am. And also to remind each of you to please scan the QR code that's found on your program and to give us feedback about our CRCB luncheon. Thank you so much for attending today. Yes, you can also purchase the Darkroom, the back with it via Venmo, cash, as well as Cash App. So the books are available for purchase. Books are $20.
Oh, why who you want to see?
They say it's good for your brain. At any age. It's all super hard. Well, it's good. Yeah. Doing hard things is good. I think it's like
Well, hello there, son.
Doing that, I was like, wow, this is connected.
He's got the job, he's like moved.
Okay, so it might actually be done then very fine.
I just look like he didn't come and get me. Train up. You've been, been away, so.
She was going to her. Well, I'll just wait till she gets I'm not trying to get you my shell, so. Girly.
It's not.
Appreciate it, Chris. How do you feel like it just?
I just too, I love it, I love it. It was a pleasure to meet you.
I was telling you, it's
Change,
Chicago.
you know. Because my son.
Yes.